Walter White was the chemist. Gus Fring was the strategist. But there was one man in the Albuquerque underworld who was more complex than both of them. His weapons weren't a gun or ricin. They were words, empathy, and a complete, terrifying understanding of the human condition. Jimmy McGill is arguably the greatest manipulator in television history. He doesn't just lie, he constructs realities. Today, we're listing his top scams and manipulations, and we're going to reverse engineer the psychology of Slippin Jimmy to understand why everyone in his orbit keep falling for it. Let's get into it. First of all, I have to warn you that this video contains spoiler. First, the fake Rolex con. Before Albuquerque, Jimmy is already an experienced con artist. One of the clearest examples is the fake Rolex scam with Marco. Jimmy and Marco approach a stranger in a bar. Then Marco pretends to be extremely drunk and vulnerable. Jimmy appears to be helping him. The target sees what looks like an opportunity, a valuable watch and a desperate man. Jimmy then subtly creates the idea that the victim is actually taking advantage of Marco. The victim gives money for the supposedly valuable watch, and then the victim walks away. And Marco suddenly gets up. The whole thing was staged. The target wasn't simply fooled by a fake watch. He was manipulated through greed. Jimmy understands that people are often easiest to manipulate when they think they're manipulating someone else. This becomes one of his fundamental principles. Jimmy doesn't always sell people something. Sometimes he sells them the opportunity to exploit someone else, and that's why they participate willingly. The con is later repeated with Marco, but the second time doesn't work nearly as well because Jimmy has become emotionally attached to his old life, and the circumstances are different. The show deliberately demonstrates that Jimmy's greatest cons often work best when the audience doesn't know exactly how they're being performed. The skateboard scam. One of Jimmy's early Albuquerque schemes involves two skateboarders pretending to be injured after being hit by a car. The goal is to make money through an insurance settlement. Jimmy plans the scam carefully, but the skateboarders accidentally target the wrong vehicle, and they end up dealing with Tuco. This is an important failure because it reveals something about Jimmy. His intelligence doesn't mean he controls the world. Jimmy can manipulate ordinary people extraordinarily well, but criminals like Tuco operate according to completely different rules. Jimmy's usual weapons are words, psychology, and deception. Tuco's weapon is violence. This encounter teaches Jimmy a lesson. There are people you can manipulate, and people you need to survive. That distinction becomes crucial later when Jimmy enters the Salamanca world. The Kettleman family. The Kettlemans are one of Jimmy's first major demonstrations of psychological manipulation. Craig and Betsy Kettleman have stolen approximately $1.6 million. Jimmy realizes that they are terrified of going to prison, so instead of simply telling them they're guilty, he gives them something much more powerful: fear. He makes them believe their situation is worse than they thought. When the Kettlemans disappear, Jimmy realizes they staged their own kidnapping. He finds them hiding with their stolen money. Now Jimmy has leverage. The Kettlemans offer him a bribe to keep quiet. Jimmy initially appears to reject it, but he secretly keeps the money. This is classic Jimmy. He creates a situation where the other person thinks they are controlling the negotiation, but Jimmy has already designed the game. The Kettlemans think they're buying his silence. Jimmy is actually using their fear to gain both money and leverage. The elder law clients. Jimmy eventually discovers that elderly people are a massive potential client base, but rather than relying entirely on traditional advertising, he builds personal relationships. He talks to them, he remembers details, he makes them feel important. This is one of Jimmy's biggest strengths. People don't simply trust Jimmy because he's convincing. They trust him because he makes them feel understood. That's why his elder law practice becomes successful. Jimmy's manipulation isn't always malicious. Sometimes his ability to understand people genuinely helps them. And that's part of what makes his transformation tragic. The same talent that could have made him a brilliant, legitimate lawyer becomes increasingly corrupted. The Sandpiper Discovery. Jimmy discovers the Sandpiper case almost accidentally. He notices irregularities in the company's billing, but then he realizes something. The elderly residents don't fully understand what is happening to them. Jimmy uses his ability to communicate with them and uncover information. This isn't really a scam. It's Jimmy at his best. He's using his street intelligence, legal knowledge, and ability to talk to ordinary people. But later, Sandpiper becomes central to one of his darker manipulations, making Sandpiper settle. Jimmy eventually becomes obsessed with getting the Sandpiper case settled. He wants his money. Kim also becomes increasingly interested in pushing the case forward, but the settlement requires pressure. Jimmy understands that corporations respond to incentives, deadlines, and public perception. Eventually, his manipulation becomes much more aggressive. He uses information, publicity, and pressure to influence the settlement process. This is where Jimmy's ability begins transitioning from clever lawyering into psychological warfare, damaging Chuck's credibility. It is one of the best examples of Jimmy manipulating Chuck through a combination of technical knowledge, emotional pressure, and misdirection. One important clarification: Jimmy doesn't literally rewrite the numbers in Chuck's documents himself. What he does is manipulate the Mesa Verde address numbers on the documents so that Chuck's carefully prepared legal work contains an error, while making Chuck believe the mistake was his own. Chuck has been preparing Mesa Verde's banking documents for their expansion. Jimmy therefore creates a situation where Chuck's own confidence becomes the weapon against him. Jimmy goes to Chuck's house and secretly changes the address number on the Mesa Verde paperwork. The crucial detail is that Jimmy changes the street number from the correct number to an incorrect one. Chuck later reviews the documents and doesn't notice the change. Why? Because Chuck has already convinced himself that the documents are correct. That's the psychological trick. Jimmy doesn't want Chuck to think that he changed the documents. He's trying to make Chuck think, I must have made an incredibly embarrassing mistake. Why Chuck is vulnerable to this? Chuck's entire identity is built around being the competent lawyer. He believes he's meticulous. He believes he's intellectually superior to Jimmy. And he especially believes that Jimmy is incapable of beating him intellectually. Jimmy understands this perfectly, so Jimmy doesn't attack Chuck's intelligence directly. He attacks Chuck's confidence in his own perfection. When the Mesa Verde paperwork is submitted and the address is discovered to be wrong, Chuck is horrified. The mistake appears to be his, and that's exactly what Jimmy wanted. The Chuck Barr hearing. This is arguably Jimmy's greatest manipulation of a courtroom. Chuck believes he can destroy Jimmy intellectually. So Jimmy changes the battlefield. Instead of fighting Chuck's legal argument directly, Jimmy attacks Chuck's credibility. Jimmy knows Chuck's condition is based around his belief in electromagnetic sensitivity. So Jimmy introduces the battery. He secretly places a battery on Chuck. Then he gets Chuck to admit that he didn't know it was there. The courtroom watches Chuck's reaction, and then Chuck becomes increasingly emotional. Jimmy has transformed the trial from, "Is Jimmy guilty?" into, "Is Chuck mentally reliable?" This is masterful psychological manipulation. Jimmy didn't defeat Chuck through superior legal reasoning. He made Chuck destroy his own credibility. Psychology today describes Jimmy as a creatively deceptive character whose creativity allows him to generate elaborate, self-serving forms of dishonesty. The photo and the prostitute scheme. Jimmy uses a combination of staged photographs, planted evidence, and carefully orchestrated situations to make Howard appear compromised. He doesn't simply say, "Howard is a bad person." He creates evidence that encourages other people to reach that conclusion themselves. This is Jimmy's signature. He prefers indirect manipulation. The target shouldn't hear. Jimmy wants me to believe this. They should hear. I came to this conclusion myself. The Howard Hamlin sabotage. Jimmy and Kim eventually begin targeting Howard as part of their plan to force the Sandpiper settlement. This is where Jimmy's manipulation becomes deeply destructive. They manufacture situations that damage Howard's reputation. They create false impressions. They manipulate his relationships, and they make Howard look unstable. Eventually, they engineer the appearance that Howard is involved in drug use and inappropriate behavior. Why does it work? Because the manipulation isn't built around one giant lie. It's built around many small pieces of believable information. That's an important lesson about Jimmy's method. One unbelievable lie is easy to expose. A collection of small, believable lies can create an entirely false reality. The Gene taxi driver manipulation. After becoming Gene, Jimmy initially tries to live quietly, but eventually the old Jimmy returns. He manipulates people by exploiting their weaknesses and curiosity. One particularly important example involves Jeff, the taxi driver who recognizes him. Jimmy initially fears Jeff, but instead of simply running away, Jimmy studies him. He discovers what Jeff wants. Then he manipulates Jeff into participating in his schemes. Again, Jimmy converts a threat into an asset. This is something Jimmy has done throughout his life. When someone has power over him, he tries to make them dependent on him. The department store heists. Gene eventually starts recruiting people for increasingly elaborate burglaries. These aren't merely thefts. Jimmy turns them into performances. He creates roles. He establishes trust. He manages people. He improvises when things go wrong. This is basically Jimmy returning to his Slippin Jimmy identity, but now he's much more sophisticated. The tragedy is that he isn't returning to who he was. He's returning to the part of himself that he never completely abandoned. His final manipulation, the courtroom. And then we reach Jimmy's greatest manipulation, the finale. Jimmy is facing an enormous prison sentence. He negotiates an extraordinary deal. Then he gets a dramatically reduced sentence. And for a moment, Saul Goodman appears to have won again. He manipulated the prosecutors, the legal system, the situation. But then he hears that Kim has confessed, and something changes. Jimmy decides to tell the truth, but even then, he does it in the most Jimmy way possible. He gives the courtroom a performance. He tells the truth, but he also carefully controls the narrative. He explains his relationship with Walter White. He explains his involvement in criminal activity. And eventually he admits, he is Jimmy McGill. For once, Jimmy isn't manipulating people to escape consequences. He's using his greatest talent, his ability to control a room, to tell the truth. And that is why the ending is so powerful. For most of the series, Jimmy uses performance to hide himself. In the finale, he uses performance to reveal himself. Jimmy ultimately accepting responsibility and returning at enormous personal cost toward an honest identity. So why is Jimmy McGill so good at manipulating people? Now we've reached the real question. What makes him different? There are 6 major psychological abilities behind Jimmy's success. 1. He reads people extremely well. Jimmy is constantly asking, what does this person want? Money? Respect? Love? Recognition? Security? Revenge? Approval? Once he understands the answer, he knows where to push. 2. He knows how to mirror people. Jimmy changes depending on who he's talking to. With elderly clients, he's warm and charming. With criminals, he's confident and street smart. With judges, he's respectful. With ordinary people, he's relatable. With wealthy people, he can imitate their language. With Kim, he's emotionally vulnerable. With Saul, he's aggressive and flashy. He's essentially a social chameleon. 3. He is an incredible storyteller. This may be his greatest ability. Jimmy doesn't simply lie. He creates narratives, and humans naturally understand the world through stories. If Jimmy can control the story, he can influence how people interpret reality. That's why his scams are so effective. 4. He thinks on his feet. Most people need a plan. Jimmy needs a plan. But when the plan collapses, he improvises. A judge asks an unexpected question. Jimmy improvises. A criminal threatens him. Jimmy improvises. Someone discovers the lie. Jimmy improvises. The original plan fails. He creates another plan. This makes him extremely difficult to predict. 5. He understands self-interest. Jimmy's most powerful insight is this: people usually don't need to be forced to do something if you can make them believe it benefits them. The Kettlemans want safety. Howard wants professional respect. Chuck wants justice. The elderly want someone who listens. Criminals want someone who can solve problems. Jimmy sells each person exactly what they want. 6. He has almost no fear of embarrassment. This is massively underrated. Jimmy will do things most respectable people would never consider doing. He'll make a ridiculous commercial. He'll humiliate himself. He'll lie. He'll dress absurdly. He'll exaggerate. He'll make a fool of himself. And that gives him an enormous advantage. Most people are constrained by, what will people think? Jimmy isn't. That's why he can enter social situations that would paralyze a normal person. And finally, Jimmy McGill is not the smartest person in Better Call Saul. He's not the strongest. He's not the most disciplined. He's not the most powerful. But he may be the best people reader. He understands something that characters like Chuck never completely understand. People aren't purely rational. They are driven by ego, fear, greed, love, shame, pride, insecurity, and desire. Jimmy knows how to find those emotions and turn them into leverage, but the series ultimately shows the price of that ability. Every time Jimmy successfully manipulates someone, he becomes a little better at manipulation, and a little worse at being Jimmy McGill. Eventually, he becomes Saul Goodman. And Saul Goodman is almost invincible as a persona. But underneath the colorful suits, advertisements, and fake confidence is a man who has spent his entire life trying to convince everyone, including himself, that he doesn't care. And that's the ultimate con. Jimmy's greatest manipulation wasn't manipulating Howard, Chuck, Kim, the courts, criminals, or his clients. It was manipulating himself into believing that Saul Goodman was the person he really wanted to be. And when the series ends, Jimmy finally drops the act. For the first time in years, he stops trying to win. He simply admits who he is, Jimmy McGill. And that's why the final con is actually the first time he tells the truth. Thank you everyone for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.